First of all, thank you, ICS Village, for having me on. Look forward to spending the next 30 minutes or so talking about how OT security is not a technical problem to solve. And at the end of the session, my goal is for you to really understand some of the intricacies of where we are as an industry and what the real problems are versus what you tend to hear in the media. Let me advance my slide. Who am I? Vivek Ponnada. I'm a long-term ICS OT person. I've been doing this for quite some time. Currently, I work for Nozomi Networks. I'm a regional sales director for Western Canada. I spent the vast majority of my career with General Electric, and I have both the technical experience, technical background, as well as an MBA in finance. So I'm a mix of both. What you would expect to take in front of your board or to have a discussion about risk along with the technical aspects of it. And I also do community work along with some of the folks that you're actually working with today on this ICS Village deal. So enough about me. All right, so let's talk about what exactly is OT. I mean, this is the agenda. I only have 3 slides of content, so I'll keep it really simple. But we will definitely mention or discuss about what exactly OT means. We'll talk about the technical challenges and how I presume that they're already solved, and then some of the non-technical aspects that are really the hindrance in our industry and space. So what exactly is OT? So this is a version of the Purdue diagram that many of you probably saw a version of it, or maybe the same diagram in other talks, but I'm using this to discuss exactly what OT means. So OT is a very poorly defined term. In fact, I think a lot of IT people relate to it more than ICS people. So if you are from a refinery or a petrochemical company or a power plant or traditional, critical infrastructure, you might not relate to this term at all because you're used to being called the industrial control systems person, controls engineer. And if you're from robotics, for example, you might relate to the term cyber physical. Again, this came from Gartner. But OT as a term is not well defined. Many people have come up with different definitions. In some sense, it doesn't really matter what you call this, right? At the end of the day, it's technology, it's application. You're talking about the risk that's coming from technology to your business, so business risk. So what you call the technology, whether it's IT or OT, doesn't matter. But in other aspects, it does matter because what you do at Purdue level 2 type devices that are very much IT-like versus what you do at Purdue level 1. If I can get my mouse over here, yeah, the PLC and DCS level in managing and mitigating risk is very different. So is that OT or not? Or is level 2 OT or not? These things do matter to a certain extent on the defensive portion, right? Not so much at the exact level. So for all intents and purposes, consider that people relate to OT in different ways. So some people would consider everything in an industrial plant to be OT, and other people only consider level 2 and below to be OT. And again, just using this example, right, we have level 0 devices and sensors, actuators, and so on and so forth, controllers at level 1. And this is a theoretical model, right? So IoT devices tend to break this Purdue model, even though in this case, we're using some example where they do respect this model. But the key is OT is whatever you think is impacting production, right? Impacting operation of your plant. So what are some of the unique OT security challenges? So let's go through some technical ones, right? The number one thing that you hear all the time is that OT is proprietary hardware, unique protocols. They were not designed with security in mind. And that's true, right? They were built with safety and reliability in mind, operating in hazardous conditions, for example, for hardware, or operating for 20, 30 years, right? These things, hardware and software combined, the protocol support needs to happen over decades horizon, not, 3-4 years. So insecure by design is something that you hear as well, that there's no encryption, you use hard-coded or reused credentials, and this is also true, right? And then we also hear this flat networks with trusted access everywhere. No question, all these things are true, right? They were historically the reason why OT technical problems existed, right? Similarly, patching is a big problem, right? Unlike in IT, where you're able to patch frequently, you're able to patch um, in maybe all weekend or more frequent outages. You can maybe take one down. You have a lot more redundancy. Maybe it's a cloud, maybe it's a virtual machine. Maybe you don't really care, if something is down, right? An email service over the weekend. So patching in the IT world is very different compared to OT, where number one, the patch might not be available at all because the product is end of life, or the vendor is out of business. Somebody that you bought from 20 years ago doesn't, exist in the space anymore, or that particular hardware is out of, support. Second thing is testing and validation. It takes significant amount of resources to be able to test something to make sure it doesn't break anything if you install it, right? If you don't test it and you install it and you take a chance, it might cause loss of view because the HMI or the human machine interface is down because of this patch, or worse, it does something to the latency of the protocol, or it does something to cause an impact on your production, or maybe even worse, right? There's a safety impact because you install a patch and suddenly you can't communicate to the PLC. And so for lack of command on the safety side, maybe something happened, right? That you couldn't control. You could have done something with it if you had the view. So, and then lack of outage windows, right? So most of these critical infrastructure facilities don't take frequent outages. You only come down when you have to. So some refineries won't have an outage window for 6 or 7 years or more. Power plants might have an outage window every year, but not every week, right? And then this is another key thing. So vulnerability is not disclosed transparently, as in you wouldn't even know because this vendor didn't know, so they didn't disclose it. Maybe some other library or some other component was vulnerable. So another vendor, another product was, obviously vulnerable, and there was disclosure, but maybe not this vendor, not this product, right? Or it's unclear if it impacts you. So yes, it's a vulnerable piece of hardware or software, but does it impact you? I mean, does someone have the ability to reach that particular software or hardware in your system and cause an impact, right? So that thing is not always clear. And then not relevant to risk reduction. Patching in IT is predominantly done for risk reduction. So you update it, you're less vulnerable, so less risky. In our world, a fully patched system, fully patched HMI will still deliver a command because of the insecure by design system, right? A protocol that's not secured, it'll still respect your command if you have access to that computer. So all these are technical challenges, right? But my point is that the solutions are already there. So modern controllers have safety features and security features built in. As an example, encryption as an option is available for use with most protocols. You shouldn't be today using Modbus as an example for critical anything, right? It's one thing to use it for non-critical, maybe just information only for non-critical assets, but not for something critical, right? So that problem has been solved years ago. We have secure protocols now. Similarly, intrusion detection and prevention is possible on OT protocols. In fact, I work for a company that provides these solutions like intrusion detection. It's been around for a long time. Uniqueness in the OT side has some advantages for defenders. So, for example, allow list, what used to be called whitelist, is very easy to implement compared to IT because it's relatively static in an OT space. Similarly, compensating controls are well established if you can't do something actively, right? Administration, policies, personnel, HR policies. We have been doing this for a long time, so we know what works in case we're not able to patch the system or have a direct impact on the technical aspect. Or even more technically, if you see Python or PowerShell or some kind of malware executing, it's a lot easier to detect in our world because those things do not exist for the operations. So unlike in IT, we have some advantages because we're unique and finding general purpose malware is easier. And then at the Purdue level too, increased virtualization, a lot more redundancy is making it possible to actually patch those systems like we do in the IT world. So the comment we used to make about not being able to patch, at least at that level, has virtually gone away. And then many other IT solutions can be adapted to suit OT. So authentication and access controls, whether it's implementing MFA for remote access, or whether it's authenticating, using a certain protocol or a certain method that works in IT can be repurposed to work in OT. Also, domain controllers, Active Directory, it won't be the same one as you have in IT. You'll have a different one, but because the IT assets and the OT assets are so similar, we can use similar solutions in OT as well. Network segmentation, zone and conduits, again, you can use the same kind of routing, same kind of network switches to implement these things in the OT world, just like you do in the IT world. Signed firmware, we're seeing that quite a bit. Pretty much every vendor out there that has a significant install base these days allow for signed firmware. And then software bill of material projects. And this is not an IT or OT problem. This is a common software problem. But the point being, all these solutions on this slide, we have relatively solved the technical challenges. What we haven't been able to solve are the ones we'll talk about. The other challenges, right? So non-technical awareness. You hear this even today. I mean, less and less so, right? We're not a target. That kind of goes away when you're collateral damage, right? So general purpose malware available now, not only for ransomware, but also for OT tools. In fact, one of the tools that you probably heard about today from another talk, custom built, purpose built, general purpose, and OT targeting malware and tools, right? Air gapped. So this is another myth that doesn't go away. So there's one thing that you'll take away from this talk. One thing to know is that there is no air gap in the OT environment. This is a myth that keeps perpetuating. It used to be true decades ago, right? Over time, we've connected so many things in so many different ways that air gap is just a myth at this point. And then compliance, right? When people say they're compliant, they're saying we're doing what we're asked to do, not because it's secure. So you hear this adage as well, compliance is not security all the time, but people that don't know any better, people that don't have security as their primary focus, think that, because they're compliant, they're good. And then trusted vendors. Well, when you have remote access and you trust someone and you don't supervise that connection, you don't terminate the connection in your DMZ, you're respecting someone else's, trust, right? So that's not zero trust. This is the opposite of zero trust. People saying we have backups, they hardly have backups. When they do, they're not tested or validated. And what good is a backup if your ransomware, affects your backup as well, right? And then lack of proper asset visibility. I think some of the previous talks as well mentioned this. Most OT locations don't have a good view for what assets they have because they've added stuff for decades, right? So where we are trying to take a stock of what we have, it's not that easy. But this awareness is still missing, and that is a training and awareness issue, not a technical problem to solve. Next is management support. So if management is the one that's deciding on resource allocation, funding, and understanding and implementing your risk mitigation, strategies, right? They're not the ones that are doing it, but they are the ones authorizing it. How could they do it if you're not aware? If you have personnel that are not able to convey the risk properly, communicate risk accurately, unlike in IT, right? So in IT, you have a lot more models, you have a lot more experience, a lot more people that can do risk assessment, risk evaluation, and communicate that to management so they get the funding and they get the resources, maybe in time. In OT, we don't have that. We have a lot of personnel, especially industrial control systems people that are engineers, that are not risk people, that are not security people. There are very few people that understand the OT world to be accurately defining what the risk is and communicate that to management to be able to get the resources and funding. And then legislation. A lot of it is non-existent. For many verticals, there are no rules. There are no top-down driven rules, especially in North America. That's a big problem because some other countries, critical infrastructure is part of the government, right? So where whatever rules they have is for the whole industry because the government is responsible for it. Whereas in North America, where we have a lot of private organizations that are critical infrastructure owners, without legislation, they have to make their own judgment about what risk it is and what they're trying to mitigate against. Similarly, when there is legislation, including NERC-CIP in the power industry, a lot of it is very prescriptive. It's not risk-based. So you have a huge checklist to follow. You have an audit trail, a So it's more again compliance, right? You do a lot of checkboxing, but you're not able to truly assess if it's actually improving your security posture, if it's actually decreasing your security risk, right? And then this is another interesting thing, right? So long project cycles and non-aligned incentives. So most of the new projects, big infrastructure projects, take years to develop. So what you decided 10 years ago wouldn't probably work today, right? So you thought everything was a good system. You came up with a good plan, including maybe security, right? But what worked 10 years ago wouldn't necessarily work today. That's a problem. It's not very easy to overcome because you have to be adaptable. The construction and engineering companies are not the asset owners or operators. This is another interesting piece of our world. The people that are building, people that are engineering a solution, they're incentivized to maximize their productivity, their efficiency in the shorter term, and they're responsible for building and construction, right? Now, they will have a good plan for the future, but that plan is not operated by them. So you know how it is when you make a decision, but someone else is responsible for continuing it. Either the plan is not communicated well, or the plan is not ideal or optimal for the operators to pursue, right? But that's a distinct issue that has nothing to do with the technology. And then upgrades are CapEx driven. This is on the brownfield side. Okay, you upgraded something, but historically you invested in something for 15, 20, 25 years. You didn't really plan for yearly maintenance. You didn't really plan for yearly changes in those systems because those systems worked. They worked on day one, you tested them, you implemented them, and they worked flawlessly for the next 20 years. So if you don't touch anything, if you don't cause any external disruption, they'll work just fine. So that is a CapEx mindset, right? So OpEx wasn't really part of the strategy at the time. And then public good versus private cost of security. So when a water plant goes down or a power plant goes down or a pipeline gets disrupted, yes, those individual plants, individual organizations are affected, but the wider public is affected even more, right? And that's a problem we have because it's critical infrastructure. People depend on it. So the individuals that make the decision on implementing security measures or spending money on it, they have to think about the public good, which is hard because that's not how we train people to think about. We think about what's relevant for me, what's relevant for my organization, not necessarily all the stakeholders that you're not directly influencing. And then nation states intending to harm civilians versus companies having to defend against that. I mean, this is not even fair, right? I mean, obviously, life is not fair, but think about the situation where you're a company, a small company, large company, doesn't matter. You're having to defend against a nation state that has unlimited resources and that doesn't have a profit or a cost issue to worry about. Whereas you're investing dollars to defend against an unlimited budget and an adversary that has unlimited time. So that is another structural problem we have specifically in OT. Now, this is a work in progress. First up, the regulation, standards, and education, that's improving tremendously, right? Compared to the past few years, we've seen a lot of increase in standards and frameworks. You hear this term ISA, IEC 62443. This is a global standard, horizontally applied in many critical infrastructure verticals. NIST obviously has wonderful people working on several, both the cybersecurity framework, IT and OT specific frameworks, as well as IoT, right? So they're coming out with these standards that people can follow and it's free to distribute. MITRE ATT&CK for ICS, CCE methodology from Idaho National Labs, or the Secure PLC coding practices project that I'm actually part of. So we have a lot of increase in training and awareness. This kind of counterbalances some of the lack of awareness, right? So we're all trying to do the right thing, conveying the message to people, both in the ICS space and the management space about the risks and things you can do on the ICS side to improve security posture. And then, of course, CISA and the Department of Homeland Security, we have a lot more new directives, a lot more help, a lot more guidance coming out from them, and then updates to NERC that are more risk-based as opposed to being prescriptive. We're seeing that quite a bit. And then tabletop exercises, right? So if in the past you didn't know how to do it, now we have a lot of help. GridX happens every couple of years. Instant command system for ICS systems. This is a relatively new project, but gained a lot of traction, a lot of industry veterans leading this. Really cool to help people take the next step in improving their kind of awareness and doing the right thing, right? And in terms of carrot and sticks, we also have a stick here. So cybersecurity insurance, a lot of insurance companies are now excluding providing insurance if you don't have a certain level of cyber hygiene. And what that cyber hygiene depends on the industry, depending on the application, the size of the organization, and the impact. However, this is happening already. So unless you have MFA, unless you have certain level of secure remote access, unless you have certain audit trail, unless you're able to demonstrate that you have taken security really seriously, you might not be able to get insurance for your organization. So that's a stick. But then the real difference that'll make, I think, more security changes and more, I guess, improvements in our world is this carrot, right? Security as an investment versus just being a cost. So if you're able to demonstrate that by implementing X measure, you're able to reduce unplanned downtime, or digital transformation, right? Where by investing in this, not only are you improving your security posture, but you're able to connect more things. You're able to collect more data. You're able to run some cloud analytics. You're able to now leverage the scale that IT has using cloud analytics or machine learning. That will make a huge difference. So as long as it's a cost basis, as long as it's a process driven, as long as it's a lack of awareness driven, our industry will still struggle. However, as more and more of these digital transformation projects incorporate security, and if they do, right, but some of them are probably still leveraging old school knowledge and not doing the right thing. But if we're able to get there, and that's what makes a big difference for us. So the conclusion of my talk, we have a lot of technical debt in our world, a lot of things that are historically not secure in perspective. However, most of them can be solved or already solved. However, the issues that we have on the page are the ones that I feel like are kind of causing hindrances and still pulling our industry back. But look forward to more improvements and happy to answer any questions. Let's see, I'll stop my screen share. So I'll see if there are any questions here. Don't see anything in the chat. Anyone has any audio questions?
What do you think our biggest win is? What can we do that would give us the highest ROI?
That's a great question, right? I mean, this is where do you invest your first dollar? I think once we get past our basic cyber hygiene, right? So things that you do just because they're already well established in terms of, authentication, access controls, because that's a bare minimum, right? So that's probably a cost. You won't get a lot of return of investment on it directly. So those things have to happen. But outside of that, if you're thinking about where to invest the next dollar, I think that's the connectivity piece, right? So if you're able to demonstrate that you're able to connect more things together and get something value out of it, because obviously this is 2022. IT has figured out that data is the new gold. That's the same in OT as well. So I think a lot of industrial critical infrastructure people are realizing that as well.
But you really think that cyber hygiene is the first thing to address? Basic cyber hygiene.
Absolutely. Because, we've been talking about security for a long time in OT, right? It's time to actually do those things, right? Even if today, if you have, TeamViewer installed and you're able to just have someone remotely log in without authentication, without a proper segmentation, that's not a good look, right? Forget about security personnel, security professionals, even if you're a small water utility or whatnot, you've seen other people getting affected. So there is no justification today to not at least think about this, right? You don't have to do it right away, maybe if you don't have the funding or budgeting, but to go in front of the council, to put that in their hands to say, we have to do this. And those basics are a must. I think we have to walk past the basics to get to the next year, but we have to cross the basics. A lot of times it's just because of inertia.
I can from here or
Sorry, was there another question? Yes, not, yeah. So I guess to continue your point, yeah, definitely, I think cyber hygiene, again, that's another poorly defined term, right? So IT people think that it's pretty straightforward to use the word and that everybody understands. Not so much in the OT world. So we still have to be very specific in the OT world as to what we're asking them to do. So we're asking them to do secure remote access. We're asking them to implement MFA where applicable. We're asking them to isolate, zone and conduit so that, you apply appropriate controls where it's critical. So cyber hygiene, again, is like the OT as a term. Some people use it a certain way, but other people have no idea what that means.
Do you like the term data care better?
I am flexible. Like my point is the terms are important when used appropriately, but they're not always relevant to the executive, right? So the executive doesn't care what application, what tool or term you're using. All they care for is what am I getting out of it, right? Is it reducing my risk? Am I going to have more uptime? Am I going to have less risk to my business? So yeah, in terms of term, I'm flexible that way. That's why I'm quite okay with using ICS, OT, whatnot. Similarly, in this world, I'm okay with cyber hygiene as well. I'm not going to fight the term, but it's a question of explaining and communicating that better to the executive so that they know what we're talking about. All right, folks, there are no further questions. Happy to answer, follow up in a separate, I guess, offline, LinkedIn, Twitter, reach out to me, and look forward to the other talks. Thank you all.